Whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, so that by steadfastness and by the encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope. Alleluia. The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 20th chapter. Peter came up and said to Jesus, "Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times?" Jesus said to him, "I do not say to you 7 times, but 70 times 7. Therefore the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began the reckoning, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And as he could not pay, his lord ordered him to be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, 'Lord, have patience with me, and I will pay you everything.' And out of pity for him, the lord of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. But that same servant, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him by the throat, he said, 'Pay what you owe.' So his fellow servant fell down and besought him, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you.' He refused, and went and put him in prison till he should pay the debt. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their lord what had taken place. Then his lord summoned him and said to him, 'You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you besought me, and should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you?' And in anger his lord delivered him to the jailers till he should pay all his debt. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart." The Gospel of the Lord. Grace, peace, and much joy to you, people of God. Last Sunday, we heard the verses immediately preceding this gospel in Jesus' discourse on the church in Matthew chapter 18, where he said that if your brother sins against you, if your brother or sister, if another member of the church sins against you, then you need to go and reason with that person, rebuke without rancor, come to reconciliation. And Jesus lays out a whole process for this. First, 1-to-1, then with 1 or 2 others, then the whole congregation. And so now Peter asks, well, how many times do I have to go through this whole process with the same sinner? He thinks he's being quite generous when he says, well, it's as many as 7 times. I mean, it's a pretty elaborate thing. Jesus says, no, 70 times 7 times. Which is not a suggestion that Peter make himself some sort of primitive calculator so he can count up to 490. The idea is to drop dead to the whole business of counting sins and reconciliation attempts. And to fortify this point, Jesus tells a parable. It is a parable of the kingdom. It is a parable of grace. It is a parable of judgment. It is a parable that sets in stark relief God's mercy and love and our merciless lovelessness. It begins, the kingdom of heaven, as like a king who's ready to settle accounts with his servants. Like at the harvest in the agricultural parables, like the drawing ashore of the net in that great parable, like the very last parable. The king sitting on his glorious throne, separating the sheep and the goats, settling the accounts. One is brought before this king who owes him, we are told, 10,000 talents. Now, 10,000 was actually the largest number that could be counted back in those days. And the talent was the largest denomination of money, the most valuable coin. So it's the greatest amount of the most valuable thing. It's an incalculable debt, greater than the biggest pile of money you could possibly imagine. It's a debt that could never be repaid. But like our debt to God, as we sing in the hymn, "'Tis not all we owe to Jesus, it is something more than all." And this king settles this account by forgiving the entire amount out of sheer grace. He drops dead to his accounting. It really has nothing to do with the servant's extravagant claim that he will, given patience, be able to pay it all. He'll never be able to pay it all. Not in 100,000 years. But the king forgives him. And so he goes out of the king's throne room, having lost his old life through the king's generosity, ready to go out and enjoy his new, free, forgiven life. Right? Wrong. He wants to hold on to his old life. It's really the only way to explain what happens next in the parable, as he finds a fellow servant who owes him 100 denarii, grabs him by the throat and says, "Pay up." Clearly, this unforgiving servant never experienced the forgiveness that the king freely gave him. Somehow God's grace and this servant passed like ships in the night. Rather than let go of his old life and its keeping score, he wants to hold on to that old life. And when this is brought to the attention of the king, it becomes a parable of judgment. The king hands the unforgiving servant over to the justice, precisely the justice that he had demanded. Go to prison till you pay it off. And that would be forever. God's loving mercy, our merciless lovelessness. We all find ourselves in this situation of grace and judgment. St. Augustine asked, "Who is it that owes no debt to God?" Only the one against whom no sin can be counted. Who is it that is not owed a debt? Only the one who has never been wronged. And do we not also go out and in turn wrong others and incur debts? Jesus' answer to our indebtedness is his death on the cross. And we are invited to do the same. Forgiveness that does not keep score, the love that does not keep count of wrongs, is the finding by losing. We drop dead to our old life and its accounting. We come to a new life of forgiveness. But the dropping dead to accounting is the first piece. And that's what's so difficult for us. Because if we keep count of the sins and the attempts at reconciliation, then we're really not forgiving. We're just postponing revenge. When Jacob and Stephen were little, they used to say to each other, "You're on the way to 490. When we get to 491, Joseph's brothers thought that perhaps Joseph was just postponing revenge in bringing the family down to Egypt and saving them from the famine. And so they concoct the story. Oh, before Dad died, he said, "Would you forgive all the wrong we did to you when we sold you into slavery, please? Oh, and we'll be your slaves." What a great turnaround. But it's because they fear that he's holding his revenge in abeyance till now, or till tomorrow, or whenever the axe is going to fall. But because of what Joseph has been through, he recognizes that, yes, these brothers did indeed intend to harm him. But the God who writes straight with crooked lines meant it all for good. They need not fear his revenge. He has forgiven them. Similarly, in the tenement churches of Rome, to which St. Paul writes his great epistle, there are both Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians who disagree about certain practices of the faith in the infant church. Questions about what it's okay to eat as Christians. Questions about what holy days Christians should observe. Now, in the Lutheran Church, we call those kinds of disagreements adiaphora, indifferent things. But we know that it is precisely over these adiaphora that Christians love to fight, and to sit in judgment on one another, and to refuse forgiveness. St. Paul says we should simply do all we do to the honor of the Lord and give thanks to God. The irony, Paul thinks, is that those who sit in judgment on one another don't even actually own themselves. We owe our very being to the God who made us and forgave us. The reference point of our lives is the death and resurrection of Christ, not our own preferences or our own fears. Those weak in faith Christians in Rome, we always think the other side of the weak in faith. Whatever side we're on, we're the strong ones. The other one, they're the weak in faith. The weak in faith in Rome, Joseph's brothers, a man overwhelmed by debt. These are perfect examples of the poor in spirit, whom Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount are blessed. The kingdom of heaven is theirs by sheer grace. And that new life that comes by forgiveness brings a willingness to forgive along with it. Blessed are the merciful, for they obtain mercy. But the other side of the coin is, unblessed are the unmerciful. And there's the judgment. And so our lives, receiving and giving forgiveness. Dropping dead to our old lives and to what we think people owe us. And rising with Christ to a new life where we pass on a bit of the forgiveness we have received to others, and yet somehow we never have less. There is no power greater than this forgiveness. It opens the future. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.